Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm the chair of PLG. I'm going to not stand directly in front of it. I'm the chair of PLG, and along with Lee, have kind of put this together for us today. Meenakshi here works with the MPH program here at Simmons. And so the MPH program is the Masters of Public Health. And specifically here, they're focused on systemic racism in public health. And it's a really interesting program, and they all do work outside of the actual MPH in Boston and globally with this. And so this is a talk that I have seen you do before, a version of, that as far as I understand, you do out in the community as well. And so the purpose that we kind of came here for is to come to kind of a shared understanding of what exactly it all means, and then hopefully we can start to have a discussion about our role as librarians in a public space in this kind of work. So thank you. If you want to add anything, you're cool.
Well, we're really excited to have you here, and yeah, Meenakshi is the assistant director of the Masters in Public Health, right? So yeah. Thank you for making time for this and to share your knowledge with us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and great to see all of you join us. So thank you. We're gonna just be here until 5, so hopefully everybody can stay the whole time. This is, as Lauren said, this is an abridged version of what work that I do out in the community right now. I've been in public health for the last 15 years, and in the last 10 years, I've had my own consulting practice where I've done a lot of work with organizations that are looking to incorporate a racial justice lens into their work. And one of the primary organizations I worked with was Department of Public Health. And so as you can imagine, the Department of Public Health is like a humongous organization across the state, and they've been running public health programs for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, they're beginning to see that their outcomes are not getting any better. So, and I'm going to just use examples of health, and then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the relevance of libraries and public spaces. But I want you to just, as you hear this, as you're listening and participating, to think about if we can apply a health lens to this, but we can also apply an education lens, we can apply housing lens, we can apply any type of lens, but we're looking at the system of injustice. And so health is my background, so I'll use that example to illustrate what we mean by structural racism. But we're also gonna try to get some common language in here, because what we've seen in my work, what I've seen out there is that some people will be like, yeah, I really believe in equity. And then when you ask them what they mean by that, they are not exactly clear. And so a lot of these words get like co-opted in the movement. And so we want to be really clear about what we mean by that and see if you all, are this group that's organizing and moving forward, if you all agree on that you move forward with that same shared language and share it out to your members. The other thing is a lot of times after these types of sessions, folks are like, I just need some tools to think about this. So I want you to think about this presentation as a bunch of tools that you can put into your toolbox. You're going to get these slides. You can take any one of these slides to start a conversation somewhere if you want to start talking about equity. So just to open, I want to share some assumptions. In the work that I've been doing, we believe that it's really important to be explicit about your identity when you're talking about justice, especially in a racial justice framework. So what we're going to do is go around the room and introduce ourselves by our race, our ethnic identities, as well as our pronouns. So what pronouns would you like to be referred to with? And we do this because we don't want to misgender anyone, but we don't want to misrace anyone either. A lot of times when we're just trying to be neutral or colorblind, we make a lot of assumptions about each other, and we don't want to do that here in this space. So we'll do that. You'll hear me talk about racism explicitly, but it's not exclusive to racism. So it does intersect with classism, sexism, heterosexism, all of the other isms that are out there, but we like to look at it from a racial justice lens because that's the one that never gets talked about, right? That's the conversation that never really happens in most of these spaces. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that we're not saying only racism, but it includes an intersectional analysis. Head and heart, so I'm sure you guys have all seen data and are probably sick of seeing data, but we're going to ask you to think about this data a little bit differently, and we really say that this type of work can't be an academic exercise. It has to be something that integrates your mind and your body, and not to be like, I don't know, a lot of people always talk about mind and body, but there's a way that we become really disconnected from our bodies in our work in academia. So we really want you to hone yourself into that feeling, like that feeling that you get when you know something's not quite right, and that's what that injustice feeling should feel like. We're going to critique a lot of systems in here when we talk about the definition. So there's a lot of great people working in some pretty bad systems, like we have doctors and teachers and librarians that we care about, but the systems themselves perpetuate inequities on a regular basis. So we're going to critique the system and not the individual in the system. And in the other side, we also say, please make it personal. Depending on how you identify racially, I identify as a person of color. I don't want anyone to be doing this work on my behalf. I think that I really feel that people should do this because this work is important to them. So we say make it personal in that way, is find the reason you want to do it, whatever your reasons are. So we're going to start with with our introduction. So why don't we go around and do that? I'll start. My name is Meenakshi. I'm Asian, Indian, and I use the she, her, hers pronouns. Okay.
Hi, I'm Alejandro. I'm a white Latino. Him, his.
Thank you.
David, white, German, Polish, him, his.
I'm Lee. I'm white and European American, Irish, and what's it called? Scottish, I guess. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Okay, great.
I'm Ellen. I use they, them pronouns. I'm white and Ashkenazi Jewish.
I'm Sarah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm white and Italian.
I'm Lauren. I'm racially white, ethnically Italian French, and I use she, her.
I'm Allie. I'm white, and my ethnicity is a big old question mark, but probably European, and I use they, them pronouns.
Okay.
I'm Joe. I use they, them, and I'm white. As a white person, I don't feel that I have an ethnicity to tag onto, so not really.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Carolyn. I use she, her pronouns. I am white and European American.
Okay. So has anyone introduced themselves that way before with racial? I mean, I know that we do pronouns, but besides you, Lauren. Has anyone ever done that before? No. And so if you haven't, how did that feel to share those identities? You can say if it felt weird too.
The first time I ever did it, I definitely felt strange, although I was also in a room full of people who do that regularly when I did do that. But it felt strange to me because no one ever explicitly asked me as a white person my ethnicity.
Right.
Because there is an assumption there, you know? And it also felt weird to claim an ethnicity that I don't claim publicly, frequently, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was just odd.
Yeah, it's different. Lee, do you want to say anything?
I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, it does feel strange because we're not used to it, but in a way it feels relieving because it's something that, like you said, we hardly ever talk about race, and especially as a white person, ethnicity is something that it goes back so many generations sometimes that you don't even really know, or you can't figure it out, or you have to figure that out.
Yeah, and also I respect that folks don't know, and that's also fine, you know, and I think that there's a way, and I really believe that white people can speak to this more because I'm not white, so I can't speak to that experience, but there's a whole erasure of ethnicity for white folks, right? Is that this, you once you're raised white and someone assumes you're white, then all of your other identities are not really considered. So we just talked about those identities. There's so many cultural identities in here, and I don't mean ethnic cultures, but like what you do in your free time, what you like to do for physical fitness, what kind of videos you like to watch, if you're a parent, if you're a caregiver, like there's so many other identities we walk around with, yet so much of our life is shaped by how our racial identity, how someone else sees us in our racial identity, not even how much as we see ourselves. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's a tool right there. So if you're going to be having an explicit conversation about racism somewhere, I would say, can we just all share our identities, how we want to be seen in this room? Because it's very difficult to have an explicit conversation about that. And also honor people who don't want to share it. There may be people of color who don't want to share their ethnicity either, and that's also fair. But to get in that space where you're really starting to be explicit and not in the work world, as some of you have probably experienced, like when you introduce yourself, you're like, my name is blah blah blah, I work for this, and my job is this. So that's enough. We're just trying to see there's other ways of being with each other. Another tool is sitting in a circle. That's a whole different tool, right? Because we're so used to this power structure, and I would be sitting there with you if we had a remote control, so I don't, but I typically don't like to have that kind of a dynamic that we are all in a circle. I like to have it, we're all in a circle, all of our trainings are done in a circle. So those are just some tools to think about as you start to incorporate this work and as you go out, after you get degrees here. So I want to just zoom us back a little bit. What do you see here, and what do you see here?
Population density.
Okay. Yes.
I was thinking more of like electricity going on at that moment.
Yes. Okay. So it's a little bit about population density, but it's the world at night. So this is a composite of the world at the same time at night, and then they just put it all together. They took a picture at the same time in each place. So what do you observe? What areas are lit up?
Europe,
Japan.
Yeah.
Western US.
Yeah. The east. Yeah. So the northern hemisphere. India is lit up to some degree, but the population is 1.3 billion there. Yet it's not nearly as lit up as the east coast of the United States. So, we're starting to think about globalization a little bit, colonialism, because where are the natural resources that where do the natural resources exist that make the northern hemisphere look that way? Where are they coming from? The areas that are dark, right? So we cannot have a conversation about racism in the U.S. if we're not really talking about what's happening in the global sense, right? And so the impact of extractive policies, colonialism, capitalism, imperialism is all on this map right here. Because you can see that, we don't want the entire world to look like the eastern seaboard of the United States either. That's not sustainable, right? So this is where like climate justice and racial justice really intersect. That's not sustainable, and we don't want that. But we need to really be thinking about this when we're having a conversation about racism in the United States. We have a special kind of racism here, but racism exists on a global scale, as we all know. So this gets to that question about equity versus equality. In the public health space, in the foundation space, I see people saying, like, we believe in equity, and then when you try to dig a little deeper, there's very little substance there. So tell me if you've been to a sporting event or a concert lately. What happens when there's like an intermission in the program?
All the women run to the bathroom and there's a really long line.
Yeah, and there's a really long line. So anyone who relates to this side of the sign will be stuck in a really long line. And who else is this not working for? So anyone who goes to this side, we can say women, or who else is it not working for? Who else needs to use that? Yeah, Lauren.
It's not working for people who don't identify with either side of that
Exactly, absolutely. Who else is it not working for?
People with physical needs.
Absolutely. Who else?
Both children.
Yes. As someone with 3 girls, then it always ends up me taking my children into the bathroom, whereas my husband is not able to take them into the other side of the restroom. It's also not working for pregnant people. It's not working for nursing people, right? There's so many times we've seen that even though when it was designed, maybe the person designing it said we'll put an equal number of stalls here and we'll put an equal number of stalls here, but not really considering, from an equity lens, what does the design really need to look like for all the people that need to use it? I was in a workshop a couple months ago, and someone used a really powerful example that there was an older man pushing his elderly mother in a wheelchair and standing at the 2 sides, like trying to figure out where he needs to go. So that's the accessibility, that's the gender, like there's so many caveats in just that one example of what does it mean for us to make bathrooms equitable, so that who are they designed for? They should be designed for all of those people that need to use them, and therefore the design would look very different. The other thing I want to say is the people who are using this side of the bathroom, what are they doing while we are all waiting in line, or whoever's waiting in line? What are they doing? They've already gone to the bathroom. What are they doing?
They're able to go and get their snacks.
They can get a snack, yeah, okay, but say it's time to leave, then what are they doing while we're waiting in line? They're waiting because we came in the same car, we're not leaving separately, right? And so now the burden on them is less, right? But because we are still in line, our bladder's full, we're waiting to go to the bathroom, but they still have to leave with us. They're still gonna get stuck in the parking lot when it's time to leave. So there's a way that we have to think about designing systems so that they really have what's called a universal design feature, so that it also is beneficial for the people on this side, right? So I want you to really be thinking about equity from that lens. And we haven't even talked about racism yet, right? So this is another tool. Take the slide. If someone's talking about equity a lot, then be like, hey, what do you mean by it? Let's work this a little bit. What I've seen about these kinds of conversations is that it's not like you'll have the conversation and the person will be transformed in, a few minutes. But these little bits of tools help you get to opening that conversation a little bit. I also want to this is just an example of the design. Like there's a huge gender problem in having diaper changing stations. There's literally none in men's stalls. So this is a man having to change his child's diaper in the bottom of a stall. Like it's just not working for many of us, and so we have to really consider who's utilizing the systems and how do they need to be different. I just want to. You'll hear me using the racial justice language a lot and not diversity, and it's very intentional. We feel like diversity doesn't address positions of power. Diversity just talks about having different people of color in the room. So I've seen nonprofits do this a lot. Like they want to have their checkbox, so they'll say, oh, we really care about diversity, and they'll hire a person of color, and then they're like literally the front desk people, which is fine, which is great, but that's diversity. It's not really thinking about equity, because if you were thinking about equity, you would be very intentional about who you're recruiting into some of the higher positions in the organization. Racial justice is not equality for the reasons that I talked about, but it's really getting into the aspects of fairness and justice. Like if we think about this country's history and why things look the way they do, then we need to really think of it from an equity perspective. I want to also I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with the fact that race is a social construct. So there's nothing genetic about race. And if you've done any history around how race identity was constructed in the United States, it was done by these like pseudoscientists. This guy Blumenbach, who was from the Boston area, would collect skulls, and then he decided that like the most beautiful skull was from the Caucasus region, which is like Georgia and like Northern Asia, and he said that was the most beautiful skull, and then identified those people as Caucasian. And then he used terms that are also not used anymore, like Mongoloid or Negroid, but somehow the term Caucasian has stuck, and so in many spaces white folks do identify as Caucasian, but it's actually not true, because if you're really from those Caucasus regions, you would identify that way. So there's a way that term has sort of been carried over, and it actually has a pretty racist history. So this guy would collect skulls and basically said that people from that region were superior, and those people seemed to present as white. And the interesting thing about this country's history is that the definition of white has changed over time, right? So there was a point when like Italians and Irish were not considered white, and they got in, and then there was a point in the early 1900s that Indian people were also considered white, but then they decided they weren't, and then they got their citizenship revoked. And so there's just ways that it's shifted by just groups of powerful men really making the decision on who's considered white. Now you can't really get into the white club, it's really not possible, but we really think that the important thing to think about is that how someone is raced or racialized, so how other people see them, has everything to do with health, education, economic outcomes, as you would be really surprised to know. And the other sad thing to just note is that a lot of the work that was done in Boston around these topics of constructing the idea of race was used by the Nazis when they were doing their when they were in criminal court. They actually said, well, this was the work that was done at Harvard, and we're quoting that as our plan for why certain races are considered superior. So a real painful aspect of our history, and right here in this area, I think that's something important for us to keep in mind. I'm going to just skip this, but I want to show you a set of data. Well, actually, why don't we do this? Why don't we all stand up for a minute? We're going to do some reflecting. So if you can stand up, and even in the small circle, if you can look down and take steps really slowly, like you're walking on the ground, trying to avoid some dog poop on the ground. So just take steps, just mill about. Just don't look up, just watch your feet, avoid puppy poop. Try not to crash into someone if you can. And I'm going to count backwards from 5, and in 5 seconds, the universe will deliver you someone to speak with. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Look up. Face the person that's right in front of you. And you're going to do what we call, this is another tool, it's called constructivist listening. Have folks ever heard of that? So this is when one person primarily speaks, and this is just a discharge. You don't have to have a poignant reflection on it, But just up till now, what we've shared, the definitions, the history, a little bit of the context, if you could just share with your partner for 1 minute. And the other person just has to listen. You can smile, you can nod, but we want to really avoid the situation where someone's like, oh yeah, me too, and then your like conversation goes in a totally other direction. So we'll pick the person who has the largest hand, so you can just put your hand up and see who has a larger hand. And that person can go first, and you'll go for 1 minute. I'm going to set a timer, and you may begin. So just that person talks.
Yeah, so the beginning exercise for introduce myself just reminded me a lot in high school, the beginning of the world for being the best Hispanic student of my high school. And it was like all the best Hispanic students in all the high schools were like in this event, they were like awarding us and stuff. Like, hey, you did a good job. You're like, I'm getting all the gift cards and all this accolades.
All right, 1 minute is up. So if you could switch, and now the next person should talk. All right, the person who hasn't talked yet, go for it. It's 1 minute.
It felt different because I'm used to if any interact or introduce myself with
Like
my
still in the middle of like
just say it, but now we're going to be putting it in the context
I also like
of
how
racial justice.
All right, time's up.
Sorry, I'm not a good conversation.
So why don't you go back to your seats? Or feel free to stand, whatever works for you. So what came up for people if you would wish to share? And I would request you to share your own feelings rather than what the other person shared with you or with permission, but what came up for people when we were just doing that discharge? Okay. You're talking to each other.
I was thinking aloud a little bit more about ethnicity and whether I would choose to identify with an ethnicity or not, considering how that power dynamic does or does not. I mean, obviously everything intersects with a notion of race, regardless of race, but interacts with like the power dynamics of living as a white person in the U.S. But I'm also just learning a lot about education and how to teach this. So I'm very fascinated by all of the ways of asking that question that elicit responses.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
I shared also about introducing yourself with your race and your ethnicity as something that having been in a lot of different like community organizing, student organizing, like all these different spaces where we are talking about race, even though in the US, especially at large, and in the world at large, it's kind of like a taboo that people don't talk about enough, obviously. But even in those spaces where you are talking about race, people don't have this practice of introducing yourself. So we are still making assumptions, or we are still kind of like finding these like spaces along the edge to find your community or to like talk about your personal connection.
Yeah,
That's one thing.
absolutely. Anything else? Another person? So again, this is another tool that you can definitely take with you, is this way of having a conversation, because sometimes it is intimidating to speak up about this, and just to acknowledge the dynamic that I'm a person of color speaking to a room of mostly white identified people about racism. And so there's a dynamic there already, right? And most of the times what we see in organizations is that the person of color is deputized to talk about their personal experiences, which I'm not doing, but I'm talking to you about structural racism. But in most spaces, the way we do this work is that white people talk to other white people and really just begin to understand how structural racism really just gets to white people too. So those are all important conversations to really be having. I want to share a set of data. This is asthma emergency room visits right here in Boston. So, but this I want you to think of the analysis that I'll be applying to this data to use onto any data that you come across. Because we have to be critical of data. Data is really great at times, and then there's a lot of waste of money, in my opinion, in data when we keep studying things that we already know, right? Like, it's just kind of ridiculous. I just saw today that there was a grant to study why people on WIC and food stamps aren't using, low-income people on WIC and food stamps aren't using it enough. No, low-income people are not using WIC and food stamps enough. And then you think about like, what's the climate right now? Why would they use it if there's like all this fear and like what happens if you're an undocumented person and you're actually using that stuff? So really, like $15 million to study that. But anyways, this data is important. It comes from the Boston Public Health Commission. And this is how we traditionally look at data. This is right from their Health of Boston report. It's like a 350-page report on all various aspects of the health. So we're just focusing on asthma. And this is, you know, the neighborhoods that we're going to talk about are right in our backyard here. So I really want you to concentrate on the 3 to 5 age group here. And this is asthma emergency room visits for kids between the ages of 3 and 5. Do people in here know folks with asthma or have asthma themselves? Yeah. So when do those, and primarily for children, when do asthma attacks happen?
Isn't it, I was gonna say like when you start feeling like more, like more fear or something, like when you're.
It could be anxiety, like yes, you could also have some, yep.
Like heart rate,
yeah.
Or something requiring heart rate going up.
It's more with your lungs, but yeah, you're kind of on the right path.
Isn't it a lot of times at night?
Yes. So a lot of times at night, the symptoms are exacerbated and the child will have an episode where they can't breathe. So imagine if you're a parent that you're waking up in the middle of the night, your child can't breathe, you have to take them to the ER, the next day they can't go to school, you can't go to work, there's like medical bills. So just think about that with the data. And then tell me, like, if you look at, you know, how people are identified here, Asian folks are in the purple, Black folks are in the orange, Latino folks are in green, and white folks are in the blue. Who do you think is missing from this analysis? Yes.
Native people?
Yeah, so indigenous people. And there are a statistically significant number of indigenous people in Boston who have asthma, and they've just been erased from this data, and we don't know why. We keep asking the Boston Public Health Commission, but they don't have any good answers for us. So one thing to consider when you look at data is who's missing. The other thing I want you to consider, if you look at this, and you look at the Asian category, what kind of conclusions could you make about Asians?
Well, Asian is a very, very large group.
Yes.
So it's not subdivided into, I think, very different groups of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're a little bit ahead because if I just asked you as a layperson to compare Asians and whites, what would you say? How are Asians doing? Yeah, so we could say if white is our litmus, then Asians are doing pretty well. And then we start talking about Asians as the model minority, right? It goes, oh, look, they figured it out. However, as Lauren was saying, when you disaggregate the data, depending on our foreign policy in that country of origin of where those people come from, if they came as a refugee or if they've been, if they came undocumented, whatever their situation was, the Asian folks from Cambodia, Vietnam, different parts of Asia would look more like their Black and brown counterparts. So just be super critical of data when you see it separate. I saw something on Equal Pay Day, and it said that Asian women make 91 cents and then white women make like 84 cents. And I was like, this is not right, because you're putting in Asians like me and people from various generations before me who came over on special visas, have very high degrees, are still paid less than white people, but they're bringing up that average. You cannot tell me that undocumented Asians working in the United States are making 91 cents on the dollar. So that just creates a false narrative, right? It creates a narrative like, oh, Asians are doing all right, like, why can't the Blacks and Latinos figure it out? So we say that kind of stuff, and it's just wrong. Yes?
Also, are like different groups of people using the same like definitions for Asian? Like, does it include or not include places like Armenia, Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan? Are those going in there, or are they going in white? Are they going somewhere else?
It's really hard because a lot of, and if you look at the next data slide in this particular report, it just breaks down Asian from like mostly South and Southeast Asian countries. But that's a really good point, because that's all Asia. If we're counting it all as one continent, then why aren't they included in there, right? But if they're identifying as white, then they're getting put into that category regardless of their ethnic identity. So it's really, you know, we have to be super critical of data. So if you walk away with anything from today, is just think about, how can I apply this analysis to any of the data that I begin to see? So I'm going to go really quick through these slides so that we can have a little time to have a conversation at the end of this. So this is how we look at data through our work, is on a map. So if you live in Boston, find yourself on the map. I can't afford to live in Boston, it's too expensive, so I live outside. But I hang out in JP all the time, so you can consider me in there. And then we look at asthma emergency room visits on a map. And what you see is that it's a heat map, so you see that the areas that are the darkest have the highest rates of asthma emergency room visits. And so this is like a very predictable thing. This is a phenomenon that's been happening in health for 25, 30 years, maybe more since they started tracking it, is that we say like, this is the crescent of public health. This is where it all sort of goes wrong. You know, this is where we have the highest rates of asthma. And this is just asthma, but highest rates of out of school and in school suspensions, highest incarceration rates, highest rates of people who are foreclosed, or homes are foreclosed. And then I just ask you to, I didn't put this map into the presentation, but they have another map that says where people have jobs in arts, science, and business. So what would you think that map looks like?
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite, right? So they don't live there. So the people living here also have jobs where they're working outside. There may be less like insurance. They may have more high-risk jobs where that's also impacting their health, right? So when we just say it's asthma ED visits, we're not really thinking about the whole picture. So put that analysis on it. So this is asthma. This is where Boston's open space is. So what do you observe of this? Where is the green space and the open space in Boston? Not in the crescent. So it's almost the inverse of the crescent. And what we're saying isn't that if you live here, you'll definitely have asthma. And if you don't, then, you know, but there's got to be some connections that we have to make. And that's what we're trying to do in the public health space. This, I'll just go over quickly, but this is where the largest Superfund sites used to be in Boston, right in Roxbury. So have folks been to Roxbury and Dudley Square? So there was like a high number of diesels, but there was a lot of toxic dumping in that area. And there's so many of those, what are those things called? Brownfields? Those sites that just cannot be developed because the ground is so toxic. There's tons of brownfields there too.
So,
And
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was like, that's what those things are. Like,
Yeah,
there's
that's what
lots
those
of
are.
land that
Yeah,
is-
you're like, why are those underdeveloped? And we've heard from people saying that like Roxbury is the last final frontier of gentrification in Boston, because that's really where it's going after this. Like, once the blue bikes come in, you know that that's coming. I have a feeling about that. So do folks know what the connection between asthma and lead poisoning is? Do you know what the proxy is for both? Do folks know? So you can get lead poisoning from old housing stock, which there's a lot of in Boston. And even though there's been laws in public health, we've known about lead poisoning for 120 years now. But the laws were just put in the 70s that if you have children living in the house, you cannot have lead paint. However, there's many ways to bifurcate those laws and just still continue to rent out. And so this number, if you can imagine, they've just increased the way that they're testing this. So it should be twice as red as it is in terms of lead poisoning. So this isn't Flint, this isn't somewhere else in the world, this is Boston, and these are children with high levels of lead in their blood. And what we know about the consequences of that on educational ability, on all kinds of other things that happen to people who have severe lead poisoning is happening here too. So again, you see that similar crescent there as well. And this is changing a little bit, but now I want you to put the lens of poverty on top of this, that the darkest areas are where people live in highest poverty. So you're, again, seeing a similar pattern. However, this is from 2009. So with the wave of gentrification that's happening in Boston right now, it's really starting to shift. So it's starting to look very different from this, and I don't have an updated map. And this will just give you a sense of why Boston's the fifth most segregated city in our country. The blue dots are white people, so you can see exactly which neighborhoods they're segregated into. And then all of these are mostly people of color. So green is Asian, and then black folks are red, and then Latino folks are in the yellow space. So really, like where you see like highest concentration of Latinos is in East Boston too. You can see that, and we know that from the population that lives there. However, with the changing way that our economy is shifting, you will see that, you know, this map will look very different. This is from the New York Times. This is a picture of a cute puppy, in case anyone's depressed right now. We like to put up cute puppies just to try to make you feel better, because this is like pretty rough data, especially when we do this for public health people. It's a bummer, because a lot of people are doing this work their whole lives, and it's kind of hard to be able to like hear that a lot of our public health interventions are not working. So I just wanted to give you a little reprieve from that. And I also want to talk, so as I was saying before, like why should racism be important for white people to think about as well? I want to show you, this is a map of infant mortality in the world for the top 32 OECD peers, which is, you know, I have problems with that language, but this is how they've stacked it. So, you know, Finland has the lowest rates, then you have Iceland, Estonia, Japan, Norway, Czech Republic, and all the way down. Turkey's right at the bottom. Here is the United States for infant mortality rates. We have the highest infant mortality rates, one of the highest infant mortality rates. And if you take people of color out of that, this green line is where our infant mortality rates are moment, because we always, you know, there's this narrative that racism is a people of color problem, but we all have to be in the same system. We all have to be in the healthcare system. And I can guarantee that there's white folks who have had traumatic experiences giving birth in the healthcare system as well. And that's why, so we're not, you know, even if we take, you know, we say we want to improve health for women of color, it's still not getting us very far unless we really think about what our system is doing. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that that's another lens. Okay, so I'd like you to get up again and just like find a different partner from who you were speaking. You don't have to mill about just because we're running low on time. And I'd love if someone would read this out loud, this statement, and then I'd like you to talk about it. Someone want to volunteer? Yeah, go ahead.
Controversy erupted in 1936 after the American Library Association elected to hold its annual conference in Richmond, Virginia. The local planning body told ALA's Black members that although they would be permitted to use all hotel entrances, they would not be able to register or eat at conference hotels or attend meals scheduled as part of the conference program. And for all conference sessions, they would have to sit on the right side of the room. After weeks of silence on the debate, ALA responded it was not the province of the organization to take up the question of general social or personal discrimination. This was not a neutral stance on ALA's part, but an active endorsement of Jim Crow laws.
Okay, so if you can take that and use that constructivist listening framework again, but you can, we can actually make this more of a conversation. I want you to think about all of the frames that I just shared in terms of your analysis and think about how you would think about this particular situation. So this idea of like, we are not going to make a statement. Like, you know, large organizations do this all the time. Like, so like the American Public Health Association has said terrible things about people of color. Like I really cringe when I think about that. And there's been no active apology or recognition that we've actually caused that much harm. And so I thought this was a really good example because there's a way that libraries are considered to be a neutral space, but we know it's not, right? Because the way that the policies are enforced and carried out is actually having inequitable outcomes, especially on people of color, but also on like homeless populations and poorer people who cannot afford the fines. So I want you to really just share what you're thinking of, like the analysis we just got about structures and racism onto what this example is showing, okay? So I'm gonna leave it up to you. I'll give you 2 minutes to talk. You can either talk one person at a time or feel free to have a conversation about it, but this is just a way to share what's on your mind as you look at an example that's closely relevant to your field. You can start.
Do you have a preference for conversation or listening? I mean, either one's fine, but if you would like. Yeah, so I guess not that.
All right,
Yeah.
2 minutes is up really quick, right? And we only have 15 minutes left together today, so I wanna get us back. So if you can take a seat and share what might have come up for you during this discussion about this, you know, historical thing, but ongoing struggles in library sciences.
It just immediately reminded me of April's issue at ALA Midwinter that kind of started us all like really trying to work on this stuff. And then the whole idea of this like non-statement statement,
Yeah.
and how frequently that is used in like any organization, but especially organizations that are like quote unquote progressive and, you know, whatever, that like, this is our statement of neutrality, but your actions are never neutral.
Yeah.
And like library spaces, museum spaces, cultural heritage spaces are inherently not neutral, and like no, the organizations aren't acknowledging that they inherently aren't neutral.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely. How about others?
Yeah.
So speaking of the neutrality thing, we were talking about, is it possible the way that the United States is right now, is it possible to take a neutral stance on race? Is it possible to have a neutral space on race? Is that something that's even desirable? And I think that a lot of white people view white spaces as neutral, or white conversations as neutral.
Right.
But with race dynamics in the United States, it's not.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible.
Yeah. And it's impossible to be neutral because all of our data shows us that the outcomes are inequitable by race, right? So if we were neutral, then our data would show us, but our desire is to be neutral and not to say anything, like the unstatement. I know so many situations where something's happened and then no one says anything. And then people are like, why didn't anyone say anything, right? And primarily it ends up being people of color speaking up in those situations because then some white folks are like, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to, and then you get into that kind of space because people are not used to being explicit about that. Right? And even just to name it and say, wow, that was really uncomfortable. Like, then everybody else is like, yeah, I was also feeling that way. But it's almost like the first person has to speak up. Otherwise, it'll just be that silent assumption of neutrality, but it never is neutral.
Yeah.
Any other? Yeah.
I, especially when talking about being actively anti-racist as a white person, one of the parts of this that is hard for me to tackle and is probably the biggest challenge is how much of that work is saying something and it's also being inconvenienced by it. Because to change the location and to change the stance on Jim Crow laws was not going to be easy.
Yeah.
It's really like, if you're looking at it in terms of justifying it by cost or of effectiveness, or even like ratio of who's going to be inconvenienced versus who's not, it's really easy to justify continued racism. And it's also really easy to not admit it or not do anything about it once you've admitted it because you're like, it's too big, I can't do anything about that. There's so much inconvenience that goes into actually moving forward on it, and I'm getting more and more used to having the conversation without feeling like I'm a part of the action because of the ways in which white supremacy like totally rules the way I act, and regardless of what I'm aware of or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we usually say about that is also that equity as a design principle is actually more cost effective. We always talk about the sidewalk cuts. Those that's an example of universal design. So that works for people with accessibility issues, but it also works for parents with strollers. It also works for elderly folks with walkers. It works for the UPS people. There's just a way that some of those things have a way of increasing the benefit to the public good. And we know that when we design, I work for this, I'm on the board of this health center in Jamaica Plain. When we design our programs to work for Black, transgender, undocumented women in Dorchester who are living in that crescent, then it's going to work better for everybody. Like, so what would be an example of that is, okay, let's have Saturday clinic hours. Well, that'll work for like the white women who live in JP too if they work full time and they also need Saturday clinic hours. We'll do, multilingual providers. Well, that'll work for people who come from other countries who also need multiple languages. So there's ways that we can talk about equity as a design principle that actually has overall benefits. But I hear you on that. There's real sense of that, what this system is so huge and it's been set up for so long that how will we even begin to shift it? And what we say is that, those shifts happen in small little transformations. It starts with a conversation, then a group organizes, then they begin having some explicit conversations, and that's when those systems begin to start to shift. But systems are huge. I feel you on that. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to share an article with you, Lauren. I gave this to Lauren. There's an organization called GARE, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. And they're doing a lot of work about racial equity in library spaces. They've done a national initiative that really starts to look at addressing some of this idea of this like neutrality, and then how it actually results in unfair access and outcomes. So just keep this will be in that report, but I just put up this quote from that. I wanted to just share, we won't have time to go through all this. I wanted to share our definitions that we use for racism is that if you, if hopefully I've done a good job of putting all of this together, is that we're really talking about a system. We're not talking about individual acts of racism against each other, although that's a part of racism, but we're talking about the way the system perpetuates the racism itself. So a lot of times people will say, well, let's have a conversation about race. And then I would invite you to say, well, do you really mean racism? Because race is a social construct, right? There's really, essentially, if you want to say that it's socially constructed, but the system of racism is what impacts all of these outcomes. So just an invitation to think about that differently. And I just want to go through the levels of racism that help us sort of compartmentalize like how we should really be working on this in a movement perspective. So internalized racism can show up for white people as well as people of color. So if you identify as white, how would you say racism, what are some of the ways that racism could get internalized for white people? Yeah.
What books you are more likely to read.
Yeah.
Who wrote them.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're like instinctual, like I'm gonna cross the road right now,
Yeah.
across the street,
Yeah.
or that kind of stuff that you maybe do without thinking the first time around and might reflect on later.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things.
Yeah. So it's like all of the messaging. So if we found this picture when we Googled family. And so there's lots of families who look like this, good for them. Like, there's not judging that picture, but there's like, this is heteronormative, she's like in her pajamas, he's going to work. There's like a very like, what is considered family in the United States mentality is white. And, you know, two parents, hetero couple or whatever, this does not reflect how our world looks and how America is starting to look, right? But there's this assumption that, you know, most white people don't walk around saying I'm better than other people, but there is this like superiority that kicks in just because of the messages we get, the dolls we see in the store, the TV shows that are on, who are the characters in them. It just, and even something as simple as like what kind of shampoos are in the hotel when you go there. You know, those are just for some very specific kind of hair. And so all of those ways that it's kind of indoctrined becomes internalized for white people. So that's what we call white superiority. And the use of the word white supremacy is always controversial because in some places people still assume that's like, you know, KKK, but like what we're really talking about is the system of white supremacy, which gets into how we behave because we want things to be perfect, or there's just all these ways that it messes all of us up. And it also gets internalized by people of color because we take those cues from white supremacy and we begin to believe some of those things, you know. And so I want to talk about internalized as that, you know, how it impacts white people as well as people of color. The interpersonal is where we spend a lot of time, you know, that's where the videos of the Starbucks guy or the person who's freaking out at some store and having a racist episode, we really we spend a lot of time there because we believe we can change individuals, but this is really not about individual change because even without the people, the structure would work that way itself. Institutional racism is when there's institutional policies or practices that have inequitable outcomes. So can you think about any institutional ways that a policy or practice has an inequitable outcome by race? Could be here at Simmons, it could be anywhere.
Suspension rates in schools.
Yeah.
And just the whole school to prison type
Yeah.
thing. So policing, the whole justice system.
You're kind of getting to structural, but good, you're on the right path. Yeah.
Also in education, because that's my background, but when they schedule parent meetings, when they schedule community meetings and things like that, which is not only racial, but
Classes,
many other,
yeah,
many other groups,
absolutely,
but
yeah.
I don't know if this really counts, but I used to teach college level biology, and when I would try to find, like, it was anatomy, and when I would try to find pictures of people or like organs or anything to show, I could not find people of color. They were always white people. They'd be white skin, you know, flowing blonde hair.
Right.
And that goes with, like, you know, who's illustrating the textbooks, who's teaching these things.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? So in the work that Lauren and I do together, we you know, Lauren sends out an email once a week about opportunities that are available to MPH and undergrad students, and we've started being really explicit about unpaid and paid internships, because if you can afford to take an unpaid internship, that means you have some level of accessibility that someone who maybe needs to support a family or has other obligations cannot take, and that really reproduces racism and classism, because if you have that one opportunity this summer, then you get your next job based on that, and it really is a cyclical way. So unpaid internships are an example of that.
I also found another thing that I think would move into structural. I found it through looking for stuff for work, but about housing in America and how housing policies, like from way back, you know, made people of color not able to buy houses when they were affordable for a, you know, middle to lower class family to purchase. And the fact that generationally then now there are, you know, white families that are gain generational wealth from that house that was affordable then is not affordable now.
Absolutely.
And how that changes your access to do things like unpaid internships or go to college without loans or that kind of thing.
Yeah, so yeah, you definitely are in structural. And so also to what Lee was saying, like the way, what we call the system of mass incarceration, it's not just one institution, it's multiple institutions, and it's all of our policies and government policies that have been implemented over time. That's really structural. And structural is the hardest, it's the biggest, it's probably the most overwhelming, but it's the one we are least likely to talk about. So, you know, for mass incarceration, the schools have to be down, the bail bonds have to be down, banking and lending, housing, public housing will kick you out if you have any kind of conviction against you. So there's ways that we perpetuate the system, and similarly with housing, similarly with how schools are funded right now. They're funded through a tax system. So if your property values are up, your schools are great. If they're down, then your schools tank. So they're just, you know, I really want you to think of this also as a Venn diagram, because there's ways that, you know, you can't be in structural oppression one day and then interpersonal tomorrow. It's like we all walk in all of these. And I just want to show you, so this is getting to a little bit of what Lauren was saying. This policy was called redlining, and this is a Boston map from 1938. So this is like a real example of old school racism, is they would take out a map and they would pick pockets of where the majority of people of color lived and put them in red and yellow, saying they were the highest risk for home or business loans. So if you were a person of color trying to buy a business or a home in these areas at that time, you would either have really high rates and be considered a very high risk loan, or if you lived there already, it would be almost impossible for you to sell your property. So those areas become ripe for, like, you know, liquor stores and like, you know, check cashing places or whatever. And then the schools go down, then all the white people left. And so you can really see that, you know, those slides I showed you about asthma from before and like where people work and the lead is very intentional, right? It didn't happen by accident. So if you're interested in maps, there's a website called mappinginequality.org. And they have a bunch of maps from all across the country that show you the redlining that happened there. There's also a really good book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and he really talks about this idea of how this has created generational wealth that is what is really leading up to the wealth gap. So the last thing I want to share is that one of my favorite quotes is that, you know, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you come because your liberation is tied up with mine, let us work together. So I will end on that. Thank you. Any questions? I know that was really quick, but hopefully it's the beginning of a conversation that y'all have with each other, and then begin to address, you know, why are libraries, you know, I think the teaching field, also education field, has to address this. You know, my kids go to school in Framingham. We have 40% students of color, and there's no classroom teachers that are non-white. So we're having these conversations with principals and with the administration, but I think library science is going to have this conversation as well, is that what is happening in this space that folks are not able to enter into it, and what, you know, and not just people of color, but people of all other identities, and how are they able to be in this space. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have additional resources on how you're doing this teaching? If you have like the full PowerPoint or other resources for teachers, or
Sure.
That would be.
Yeah, absolutely. We send an email out to anyone who attends. This full training is 2.5 hours usually, and we go through infant mortality data. We also spend some time talking about different approaches, but I will share that with you, and then I can share all the other resources that we share out with people, which is like small videos and, you know, why do we talk about intersectional, what is the term people of color really, what are the origins of that, and so I'll share that whole
And I
list.
can send it out through the PLG listserv. Also, if everyone's on that, then, and if you're not, let me know.
I don't think I am.
Okay, write down your email.
Oh, do you have a sign-in sheet for today?
We can make one
do
right
right
now.
So before we all leave,
If I put it
if
on
there
there.
If there aren't any questions, I just ask everyone to stand, and then we're just gonna do a one-word closeout. So,
I was just gonna check real quick if anyone online,
Yeah.
the online people would have had questions. If
I think I heard a ding, but I thought that was someone's phone, so we should see if someone is trying to.
Sorry.
I just like.
Click on the.
Yeah.
In the chat maybe, which is down here, if you click that little arrow.
Yeah.
Or they could turn their microphones on too, I think.
there it is.
Nope,
Anything online, people? Anyone online?
I think there's one, but
Maybe one person.
yeah, there was.
Can't
I
say
know.
her name.
Susan? Susan.
Oh, no, I
Oh,
don't.
that's Susan. Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe we
She,
don't have.
yeah, maybe. I don't know. Anyway. So let's just stand in the circle and I just pick one word. I'd like to say how you're feeling. It doesn't have to be positive or make sense, but just one word you'd like to share.
Relief.
Honestly, I think fear.
Disappointment.
Hopeful,
Frustration.
thoughtful,
Difficult.
educated, processing, gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Oh, this is great.